Today I'd like to give an example of presentation 2 where I would like you to look at your academic field and identify one or two problems that you could look at for research. The example I'm going to focus on is to do with geography and the issue of poverty. In today's talk I want to look at several things to do with poverty. I'm going to define poverty in two ways. One is to do with absolute poverty and the second is relative poverty, which is concerned with Japan. And then I'll show how Japan's level of poverty has been increasing over the last few years, and in response to that the number of children's cafes has been increasing. Our first definition is that of absolute poverty, which was defined by the UN, the United Nations, in 1995, and the UN stated that absolute poverty was the absence of basic fundamentals of human life, such as water or food, access to healthcare and good shelter, and so on. So there's probably very little absolute poverty in Japan. This is more to do with very poor developing countries that have few facilities and services. Our second definition is that of relative poverty, which the OECD defined as comparing one group against another, and their common way of doing that is to take the median income and say that people who are living below half of that median income are living in relative poverty. So for example, in Japan, if the median income for most households is 4 million yen a year, then half of that is 2 million yen a year. So people who are living below 2 million yen are living in relative poverty. And the rate, according to the OECD, 3 years ago in 2014, was about 16%. And this has been growing over the last few years. And of course, that means that an increasing number of children are growing up in poverty. One response to the increasing numbers of children in Japan living in poverty has been the rise in so-called Kodomo Shokudo, or children's cafes. These are staffed by NPOs and volunteers and provide cheap or free meals to children who need them, who can't eat as much as children who are not in poverty. And there are an increasing number of these children's cafes across Japan. And of course, as a research topic, they're very interesting to try and find out what kinds of children go to the cafes, are the cafes effective, and how do they see the future for cafes in Japan. So lots of different and interesting, stimulating research issues to examine. So in conclusion, my short presentation has done three things really, which is to define absolute poverty and relative poverty, and to identify that relative poverty is the sort of poverty that does exist in Japan, and that this has been increasing over the last few years. And one result of that increase in poverty has been a rise in the number of children's cafes. And children's cafes can be a very interesting focus for research questions in the future. Thank you very much for listening.